to modes of transportation, and the monorail is probably the coolest example of that. But there's another cool example that's the Disney Skyliner, and it goes between the Art of Animation Resort and the Caribbean Beach, and then over to Hollywood Studios, and then over to Epcot. And it's a really fun way to get around. It's basically a Skyliner, a cable car that goes between destinations. And while it's not as cool as the monorail, it's still pretty cool. Now, this is not the first incarnation of a Skyliner, of a cable car, of a Skyway that Disney has had. In fact, Dave, why don't you tell us more about that?
I'm reminded distinctly of the original Skyway system, the gondola system that they had at both Disneyland, Disney World, and the Tokyo Disney Resort, and that's the Skyway. The Skyway system was a very similar type of gondola-based system that they had in place as an attraction at all three of the theme parks. So I wanted to take a look back in history and talk about some of the history of that particular attraction and how it came to be and how it relates back to where we are today. So back in 1955, when Walt Disney opened Disneyland, he had this idea for a futuristic Tomorrowland where there would be some cool things. And he was meeting with different companies about how to come up with some cool innovations and something different. So, they were working with Alweg and talking about a monorail system. And they were talking about different types of transportation vehicles. And had companies investing in the technology and doing some things with it. So somehow along the way, one of his web designers met with somebody from the Von Roll Corporation that's based out of Switzerland. Now, Von Roll, what they make is gondolas, and they had installed a number of gondolas around Europe and into Asia, I believe. But up until that point, they hadn't created any in the United States. So Walt Disney entered into a contract with them to create a gondola system to install at the Disneyland Resort, and it opened in 1956. Now, the Von Roll Corporation did everything from soup to nuts. They worked with the web designers, but it's really their design that's in the original incarnation of the Skyway. Now, Walt was thinking very forward, and he was thinking about how do we get people to Tomorrowland. So he called it the Skyway to Tomorrowland to get people to think about the futuristic way of getting in to Tomorrowland. Even though futuristic may be a little bit of a misnomer, but it looked really cool because it was hanging buckets that were moving along. So the Skyway is actually a very simple system. If you are familiar with the cable cars in San Francisco or any place else, it's a very similar technology. The way the cable car works is underground, there's a giant cable that goes in a loop. So it goes from point A to point B, and the cable car sits on top of the street, has a little thing that goes down in the street that grabs onto the cable. The cable is always moving. It's always in motion. It's going about 5 miles an hour just pulling along. The cable car just has that thing that grabs on. The conductor just grabs it and just uses the handle to grab it, basically. And it just hooks onto it, and the cable car moves because the cable is moving. And that's it. Then when they want to stop, they pull the brakes and they release the cable. And that's it. And that's how it works. It's that simple. The gondola system is really no different. You've got a giant cable in the sky instead of under the ground, and it's going in a loop that continuously moves. The cable is made of steel, and it's a rope steel, so it's actually very, very strong, very durable. And it just moves along and keeps moving in a big loop that goes from one destination to another. So it actually went from Fantasyland to Tomorrowland in a giant loop. Now, because of the distance, they got to have stanchions in between that hold up the cable and maintain it at a certain height, and they can vary the height as they're going along. And along there's these wheels that are on the stanchions, on these holding points, that keep the cable in place and help guide it to make sure that it's always going in the right place. So it's a very clever design that way. Then what the cars themselves do, is they actually just grab onto that cable the same way that the cars grab onto the cable car. The cable cars grab onto the cable underground. Same principle. They grab onto the cable above you, and they get pulled along. Now at the stations, when guests are going to exit or board the vehicles, it actually releases from the cable and continues to slide around on a giant wheel. And the wheel moves the car along at a very slow speed, and it can be pushed a little bit so that there's plenty of time for the guests to get in or out of the car. And then they just basically push it back to the end where it reattaches to the cable. There's a little mechanical mechanism that once it passes that point, it just clamps back on the cable and just gets pulled along again. Like I said, very simple. And it's an electric motor that just continues to move the cable and move the cable and move the cable. And that's it. So it continues to move along. There's, so many cars. I think At all three of the Disney parks, it was about 50 cars they'd have on the track at any time. They could take them out for maintenance, put them back on, and so forth. It wasn't so hard to do that because of the way the cables were designed. Once it's detached from the cable, you can actually push it along and take it off the track if you need to. So it kind of goes along that way. It goes up and goes across, and it would go all the way from in all three of the parks. It was a Tomorrowland to Fantasyland attraction. It was a D ticket, so it was a really big attraction. Remember that they did A through E, E being the biggest attractions, D being one step down. And those are the pretty good sized attractions that really require you to think about them as really big attractions, right? So you're really thinking about it as something cool. At the Tomorrowland side, in all three parks, it was at kind of a low level. It was maybe one story up from the ground, half a story up from the ground, something like that. But in the Fantasyland location, it was actually 2 stories up. And the reason for that is quite simple. To maintain the balance on the cables, they have to actually counterbalance it and pull the cables down or up slightly to balance the weight and the load that's going across the cables. You have a long cable that's going a long distance around the park and then returning. The only way to make sure that you can keep the weight balanced is to actually put these counterweights inside a building on the upper part. So in the Fantasyland side, if you've ever looked at pictures or you remember it at all, the building was actually up on a hill. And part of the building, you would walk through part of the building, then you would board the attraction. And it looked kind of clever. It was a cleverly themed thing, but they actually did that for the very simple reason that they could put the weights inside the building in part of the area there, so that the weights could counterbalance what was going on with the actual cable, to make sure that the cable net always had the same amount of slack in it. Depending on how much weight was there, they could adjust the cables. They actually were fairly self-adjusting, but they could actually adjust them more if they needed to. So very cool, very clever, very simple, and it was a great attraction. It was a lot of fun to ride when they had it at Disney World. Now in 1994, they decided to close the one at Disneyland. And there was one incident where a guest, turns out they had jumped out of the car. There was a story that maybe they had fallen out, but they actually jumped out. And there was one incident at Disney World where there was a worker that was actually killed through an accident. It was sort of a negligence thing, where he was doing work in an area he shouldn't have been in. He was a maintenance worker, and someone turned on the attraction, and he tried to grab the car to not get knocked off, and he wound up falling. So it's unfortunate, but it was one of those unusual set of circumstances that happens. So the Disney World one opened in 1971 with park opening, and they closed it in 1999. So here we are 19 years later, 20 years later, and they're finally putting a replacement in, sort of. Now, why did it close really? Honestly, the only reason for it is economics. It costs something to run it. It costs something to maintain it. It wasn't a people eater. They love attractions. Disney loves attractions that can move people through quickly. You can get people on and off very quickly. Boop, boop, boop. You're moving, and it takes very low maintenance, and that's the kind of thing they want. The Skyway was not that. It took a long time to load. It was about a 5-minute ride across the park from one direction to the other, and it took a while to load them. There was always a line there. It always took a little while to load. It obviously wasn't ADA compliant because you couldn't put a wheelchair in them and so forth. But they were, because both the parks in the U.S. were in before they started all the ADA rules, they were grandfathered in, so they didn't have to retrofit. So that's the way it worked. Now, there is one other note here, that originally in the Disneyland version, when they first put it in, it was the cable car itself that was hanging, the gondola that was hanging, was designed by the Von Roll Corporation. And it was a two-person seat gondola that was going along, and it had this metal bar in the middle that was the post that they used to hold it onto the cable above. And two-person seating really isn't effective. It doesn't really work so well, and that bar in the middle was really a problem. It was always a challenge. So in the early 1960s or so, Bob Gurr was commissioned to actually make a change, and he came up with a clever design that was a 4-person seating vehicle that was made of a plastic. He couldn't change the weight of it, so he had to actually change the design of it. So he came up with a plastic vehicle, or a plastic-like vehicle, a polymer, that it was actually a 4-seater that had the hook in a different place, so that way it didn't have the metal post in the middle. And it made it easier to load and unload, and since you could put 4 guests in, you increased the capacity, and you made it more efficient. So it was a really neat thing. And so when the Disney World version came around in 1971, it was the same design with the 4-person seating. So kind of cool, that he actually came up with something clever to redesign the whole idea. So Bob was really involved in a lot of interesting things. And anyway, the story is that they're back in the gondola business. They want to get back into it, and the vehicles they've created are arguably safer. They're more ADA compliant. They actually are more efficient, and I think in the long run they'll turn out to be a better system than what they had in the theme parks. But here it is. It's 40 years later, almost 50 years later. So it makes sense that they would actually be a little bit more efficient and be a better system. But I can't wait to try them. I think it's really cool. I'm glad they're bringing it back, and I can't wait to try it. I just wanted to share with you some of the history of how the gondolas worked and the whole system and sort of my little memories of it. I mean, I remember riding the gondola. It was so much fun to be up there and above everybody else. It's one of the things that I remember best about Walt Disney World. Even as a little guy, just getting up there and riding on that gondola was so cool. I mean, there's nothing scary about it except if you have a fear of heights maybe, but other than that, it was totally cool. And it's one of those things that I just really enjoyed. And glad I got an opportunity to ride. I'm sorry my kids never did, but now they can ride on the new gondola system. So I guess there's a win somewhere.